My name is Carrie Ginger and your host of the Bytable podcast, Know Better, Live Best. Today's guest is Charles Fishman, an award-winning author and journalist. He is well known for his books covering a wide variety of topics. One Giant Leap examines the space race to the moon in the 1960s. The Walmart Effect focuses on how Walmart transformed the American economy, and the book that is the focus of our conversation today, The Big Thirst, The Secret Life and Turbulent Future of Water. Listen to part one of our conversation with Charles Fishman, where we discuss all things water, where our water comes from, and what we can do to help conserve water. Know Better, Live Best is dedicated to supporting food and health literacy in people of all ages. Our mission is to cut through the misinformation surrounding food, health, and nutrition because we believe that when people know better, they can make the right choices and live their best lives. We are presented by Bytable Foods. They use blockchain and Internet of Things technology to build traceable, transparent food systems because it shouldn't take an investigative journalist to find out where food comes from. Good morning. I'm here with Charles Fishman. We are excited about the conversation today about water, and our major focus is on your book, The Big Thirst. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell everyone where you got your passion for writing?
Hi, Carrie. I am Charles Fishman. I'm a journalist and author and historian, and I've been a working journalist every day of my life since probably the 10th grade. I grew up in Miami, Florida, and I was a newspaper kid from very early on. I grew up reading the Miami Herald at a time when the Miami Herald was one of the great newspapers in the country. In some ways, it still is. And the Miami Herald had a Sunday magazine when I was growing up. Today, in 2019, there are probably only 4 papers in the whole country that have a Sunday magazine. But in the 1970s, many newspapers had their own magazines on Sunday. The Miami Herald had a Sunday magazine called Tropic. It was the place that the humorist Dave Barry got his start. Some people will recognize Dave Barry. He's sort of a big personality. And I just wanted to grow up and write for a Sunday magazine. I thought the stories in that magazine about the texture of Florida, about incredible cases of political corruption, of crime, of just the weirdest Florida stories you can imagine. The name of the magazine was Tropic. I just thought that would be a great life. And in some ways, whatever we are 40 years later, that is kind of what I get to do. Sunday magazines have disappeared, but I've been a newspaper reporter. I went to Harvard. I went from Harvard to the Washington Post. And then I went to progressively smaller places. I actually left the Washington Post to go back to work in Florida at the Orlando Sentinel. And the Orlando Sentinel had its own Sunday magazine as well that was called Florida Magazine. So by the time I was 27 or 28 years old, I was actually doing what I had imagined doing when I was 17 or 18. And I ended up as the editor of that Sunday magazine. And thankfully it lasted 10 years beyond my editorship. So I wasn't the one who shut it down. It doesn't exist anymore. But when I was editor of the Sunday magazine of the Orlando Sentinel, there were 100 Sunday magazines in the United States. Some people may be familiar with Parade. Parade is the Sunday magazine for newspapers that don't have their own. And then I went on to write for a kind of hip new economy business magazine called Fast Company, which is sort of Fortune magazine for 35-year-olds. And Fast Company is still out there thriving away in a world in which a lot of other magazines have gone out of business. And after I started writing for Fast Company, I would sort of take a few years off and go write a book. So I wrote a book about Walmart at a time when Walmart was already the largest company in the country, but we had no idea how Walmart accomplished what it accomplished. And so I managed to crack through and try and explain how Walmart did what it did, offering the very same stuff everybody else sold for less money. And then I wrote a story about bottled water. I really stumbled into the world of water, which is what we're going to talk about today. My family and I checked into a hotel about 8-9 years ago that had a bottle of Fiji water in it. You know, the way hotels have a bottle of water on offer. And the Fiji water had a little tag around the cap that said this bottle is here for your drinking pleasure. $7 will be added to your hotel bill if you drink it. And my wife had the cap off and the bottle half finished before the door even swung shut on us. We had driven to Miami and she was thirsty. And we had never heard of Fiji water. I literally said to my wife, do you think the water in that bottle comes from Fiji? And where exactly is Fiji? I hope people in the audience appreciate that Fiji water does come from Fiji. And Fiji is an island nation that's very spread out geographically. It's out far away in the South Pacific near New Zealand and Australia. And the water in the Fiji water bottles comes all the way from Fiji, 9,000 miles to the United States. And what I did was I actually threw the empty Fiji water bottle in my suitcase and took it home because I was curious about this thing that I had paid $7 for. And when I got back to my desk, what I discovered was that half the people in Fiji, 53% of the people in Fiji, did not have clean, safe drinking water at that moment. And so you could walk into a CVS or a giant grocery store or a Safeway anywhere in the United States and buy. I've never walked into a drugstore or a grocery store and not been able to buy a bottle of Fiji water. When I go around the country and talk about water, I like to use a Fiji water bottle as a prop, but I can't travel with my Fiji water. And I've never, in the smallest towns in Wisconsin and Iowa, never had trouble getting a bottle of Fiji water. So in this country, where our toilets have cleaner water than 1 out of 6 people in the world rely on every day, we are importing water from 9,000 miles away. And the people who send us that water, the people who do the work to get it to us, do not themselves have access to their own water. So that seemed kind of crazy. And every reporter picks their challenge. Some people go to Syria. I decided I needed to go to Fiji. And so Fast Company sent me all the way to Fiji to see where Fiji water comes from. And so I wrote a magazine story about the kind of crazy American passion for bottled water, including these insane imported branded bottled waters. And that's what led me to write a book. Look, I have a cup of coffee right here. I'm sure my coffee did not come from America because we don't grow coffee, right? And so I'm not here to tell you not to drink Evian or not to drink San Pellegrino or not to drink Fiji water, but there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that they are completely ridiculous products. If you want coffee, then you have to buy coffee from somewhere else. If you want water, the typical American home has 9 spigots providing water. And the dirty little secret is if you lined up glasses of water, all at the same exact glasses, all at the same temperature, in front of the CEO of Fiji Water and said, pick your water out of this lineup, he or she would not be able to. Imagine lining up 6 cell phones in front of Tim Cook and saying, pick the iPhone. Let's see which one's your product. And him saying, I don't know, they all look pretty much the same to me. So you've got a product, and the people who actually are responsible for producing it could not distinguish it from everything else. So the book I wrote is about the world of water. It's not about, it's a 350-page book, and there's 8 pages about bottled water in it. I just sort of fell into this world of water and trying to understand water challenges because of asking that question about the bottle of Fiji water in the hotel room in Miami 9 years ago.
So you just walk into a hotel room, your wife drinks a bottle of Fiji water, and here you are today.
And you know what? I never fail to ask the stupid question, right? That's a silly question. And I kind of use it as a goof when I'm speaking to a group at a university or a group of business people. And people are utterly confused when you say, here's the bottle of Fiji water. Is the water in here from Fiji? They know it's a trick question. They just don't know which way the trick is going to go. No, I'm not stupid enough to think it's from Fiji. Well, of course it's from Fiji. It is sort of silly, but that's why I never fail to ask the stupid question, because you just never know. You never know what the answer is going to be.
And most people would just open the bottle of water and drink it and not give it another thought. Or they just look for a certain branding and how it looks in the gas station or the grocery store, and they might think, oh, this is expensive, so it must be better water.
Like the Fiji water people, the smart water people, the Evian people will tell you that their passion is completely based in reasonability. And I'm married to somebody who actually quite likes her Fiji water or her Evian. And of all the people in the world, I assure you, she knows better. So fact-based argument doesn't work with bottled water. But for me, it was great because it's opened this incredible world of where our water comes from, how it gets to us, and why we're going to be in trouble in the next 10 years because of climate change if we don't start taking things seriously.
I agree. So your books seem very different if you were to just look at the titles. Is there a commonality between The Big Thirst, One Giant Leap, and The Walmart Effect?
Sure, that's a good question. There's secretly two others. I wrote a book probably 20 years ago called The Real Heroes of Business, and not a CEO among them, which was about the power and sort of imagination of frontline service workers. And I co-wrote a book with a guy named Brian Grazer just before my space book, just before my moon book, called A Curious Mind. Brian Grazer is the man responsible for the movie Apollo 13, the movie Friday Night Lights, the TV show Friday Night Lights. He's a big dog. And so we co-authored a book about curiosity. But here's the connection between a book about Walmart and how Walmart does what it does, and a book about water and our relationship with this most common and really quite simple substance that undergirds everything we do every day, and then the race to the moon in the 1960s. What I actually like to write about is how people get their work done. And so the moon is a perfect example. In the United States in 2019, it can take 8 or 9 years to rebuild a bridge, not even to build a new bridge, but a highway overpass that needs to be replaced. You know, if you start at the moment of the planning process and then you survive the orange barrel period or the shutdown period or whatever, it takes many, many years. We actually know how to build a bridge. In the case of a bridge that we're replacing, we know how to build it so well that we already built it once. So it took 11 years to rebuild the buildings at Ground Zero after 9/11. Well, that's insane. The Pentagon was built in a year, the largest office building in the history of the world. The Empire State Building rose at the rate of 1 story a day. So 200 days, including the beginning and the finishing process. Why did it take 11 years to replace buildings at 9/11? In 8 years, we went from having no idea how to fly in space to bouncing around on the moon. And when Kennedy said, let's go to the moon, there were no rockets, there were no computers, there were no spacesuits, there was no spacecraft that could land on the moon. And in the course of 8 years, all those problems were solved. Well, that may seem like a completely different set of questions than how does Walmart deliver blue jeans and milk and toys and laundry detergent cheaper than everybody else. But to me, the essential question, and this is absolutely true about water too, is how do they do it? What's different about what Walmart does? What was required of the people who took us to the moon? And when you turn on the tap, a question literally no one ever asks, even though people turn on the tap, whatever, 24 times a day, right? In the course of a day, and washing your hands, taking a shower, cooking, doing the dishes, just washing up, giving the kids a bath, flushing the toilet. Literally, an American will turn on the tap, so to speak, 24 times a day. Where did the water come from? How does it get to you? Where does it go after that? Water takes this magical journey from the spigot to the drain. It goes from being essential, pure, and reliable to the moment it hits the drain. It's don't get it. Don't let it get anywhere near me. Where does it go then? And Americans have absolutely no idea. And the reason they have no idea, it's not a criticism of us. The reason they have no idea is that it works perfectly. The system works perfectly. You never have any need to question how the system works because you never turn on your tap and have the water not come out, right? It's not even like electricity, which, whatever, once a month, once every 6 weeks, the lights flicker off. You look around, you think, I wonder how long this is going to last. And then 40 seconds later or 40 minutes later, they come back on and you just sort of roll with it. Imagine if every 6 weeks you turned on the tap and there was no water, right? Crazy. But most people can go their whole lives and never turn on the tap and have there be no water. And so, whatever, the plumber might come turn the water off because you need a toilet replaced or something like that. And so we have this brilliant system, brilliantly engineered. Most of the engineering was done 100 years ago, depending on where you live. And yet we don't understand it. And the system turns out to be a little brittle for what's coming. Climate change is overtaking every part of the United States and also every part of the world. And every water problem we've got right now is going to get worse. And a lot of places that aren't accustomed to having water problems are going to have them in ways they haven't seen before. And so I sort of viewed my job in writing this book. I viewed not my job, but my task. What was interesting to me was, let's go to places that have solved water problems. And let's go to places that have serious water problems and have failed to solve them and see what that looks like and why. What motivates people and how do you fix water problems? Water's not like other things. If you don't have water, you literally don't have an economy. You don't have human life. And so you actually can't ignore your water problems. You got to tackle them. And although I wrote the book 7 years ago, the problems have only gotten worse since the book came out. And so in some ways, people now view The Big Thirst as a kind of handbook. It's not filled with engineering drawings and math equations. It's storytelling. That's what I am. I'm a storyteller. What's it look like to tackle this in a way that's effective? And what's it look like, in fact, to tackle it in a way that fails, where you don't fix the problem? And what's the difference? And I've also kept up. I'm paying attention to water every day because there's new stories every day of both success and failure.
That's interesting. I agree with you. I've never really questioned much where my water comes from because you're right, there's never a problem with it. And we can all agree how important water is, but we never question it because it's just always there.
Why pay attention to something that works? Mm-hmm. Most of us have a fistful of things that need attention. The fact that we don't understand water is a tribute to the work that was done 100 years ago, but now it hurts us because water is invisible, and its invisibility means it doesn't get the attention it needs. Now we need to pay attention. Or if you and I don't need to pay attention, we need our public officials to pay attention.
Right. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions about water? Or what does the average consumer need to know to bring some of these questions up front to our public officials?
The fact that we all have water in the U.S. is a result not of some natural right or privilege. Way back in 1776, we founded the correct country. It's in some ways, it's a combination of luck, economics, and engineering. It is still the case that 1 out of 7 people in the world relies on water that is carried on someone's head every day. And all the people who do the carrying are women and girls. I've never been in a community anywhere in the world where people were carrying water where the men were carrying it. And that's ridiculous. We should be embarrassed that anybody relies on water that was carried on someone's head, let alone 1 billion people every single day going back in time forever. 1 billion people, by the way, is the equivalent of everybody in the United States times 3. Imagine if everybody just in the United States relied on water that was, if you had to walk to get your water every morning. So the engineered system is really important. In the United States, our water is really, really cheap. we were joking about bottled water, but if you walk into a convenience store, if you walk into a 7-Eleven or a Walgreens or a Wawa, and you go to the cold case and you take out one of those little half-liter bottles of water, they usually cost 99 cents or $1.29. It might be a little cheaper than the soda, Well, if that half-liter bottle of water costs 99 cents, you could refill it every day for 3,000 days before it had used 99 cents of tap water. You could refill it every day in the kitchen for 8 years and then put the cap back on, put it in the refrigerator, fill it just before you go to bed. And then the next morning it's ready to go if the bottle would hold up for 8 years. So 99 cents when you're in the 7-Eleven seems cheap, but it's 3,000 times more expensive than the water coming out of your tap. The problem is that most American water systems don't charge enough to maintain the system. If you live in Philadelphia, I live in Washington, D.C. If you live in Washington, D.C., if you live in Houston, if you live in L.A., the water system is typically cross-subsidized by general tax revenue. They don't charge what it takes to even run the system, let alone upgrade the system. And there's a second thing that we should really appreciate. The water system, in a place where you have to walk to get water, the water system is actually very visible. There's the women and girls walking with jars on their heads. There's actually a path worn, for 3 kilometers out to the well and back. In a place like the United States, the pipes are invisible. Even the water treatment plants, which are huge, tend to be invisible. No one knows where their water treatment plant is or their wastewater treatment plant is, and we sort of tuck them away on purpose. They're not beautiful buildings. They're industrial buildings. No one knows where the Oreo factory is either, for that matter, right? Or the Blue Jean factory. But look at the condition of our bridges and our roads. Look at the condition of a lot of airport terminals in the United States. Things we look at that tens of thousands of people see every day. Those things aren't always in the greatest shape. Now imagine what the condition of stuff that's hidden, that's invisible, that's buried is, right? So the water system does a great job every day, but it is invisible. It doesn't get the money it needs. And then there's there's pressure coming. And the pressure is that the water system was designed to collect water and clean it and deliver it, and then clean it and get rid of it with a certain kind of climate. And one of the most important impacts of climate change is moving where precipitation falls. And so if you've built your reservoirs and your wells in a certain place, and climate change shifts the precipitation even a few dozen miles, let alone a few hundred miles, which in terms of the surface of the earth is nothing, suddenly there's no water. Suddenly the water's going somewhere else. Or suddenly the opposite. Suddenly you get so much water that those systems are overwhelmed. Flooding is not better than drought. Flooding is not better than too little water. And so the system we've got was engineered in a brilliant way. It's really responsible for, in many ways, very quietly, the economic vibrancy of America. You can't run a computer chip factory. You can't run a Google server room. You can't run a soup factory. You can't run a city without good, clean, reliable water that's inexpensive. But it's not adapted to a world which is changing fast. And we not only aren't used to thinking about water, we aren't used to paying for it. We're going to need some new attitudes. I said I live in Washington, D.C. In fact, in the last 10 years, the price of water in Washington, D.C. has doubled. So the typical water bill in the U.S. is about $30 a month. So think about that. $1 a day, the same price per day as that little bottle of water from the cold case. And essentially for $1 a day in America, you get all the water you need. Not literally. People don't wake up in the morning and say, "Hey, Joan, let's turn on all the spigots and just let them run." But all the water you need, in the sense that no one ever says, "I think we ought to wait and wash the dishes tomorrow because the water bill's too high." I think we ought to pile up 3 more loads of let's get more dirty clothes before we run the washer, right? The water's so cheap that no one ever thinks about it. And then the wastewater bill tends to be more. The wastewater bill, the charge for getting rid of the water tends to be $45 or more. So people have an all-in water bill of $75 a month in a lot of places. That's both for the clean water and for getting rid of the dirty water. In DC, our water bill is typically $130, and we use half the national average. We use much less water than the typical American. And the reason it's $130 is because they are furiously catching up. When we moved here 6 years ago, Washington, D.C. had a cycle of replacing its water mains every 300 years. A given mile of water main would be replaced every 300 years, whether it was ready to be replaced every 300 years. Well, that's just crazy, right? Even a 100-year replacement cycle for water mains is a little crazy. That means that a water main installed in 1940, right, which was 70 years ago, won't be replaced until 2040. Well, guess what? In Washington, D.C., it's my favorite water main in the entire country. Runs along K Street. K Street is the legendary street right in the heart of downtown Washington. It runs east-west, and it's the street on which all these big fancy lobbying firms have their offices. And that water main, the water main from which those lobbying firms drink and make coffee every day, was installed in 1858. So it is already, whatever that is, 160 years old. And it was installed three years before Abraham Lincoln became president. And so I love the idea that these fanciest law firms and lobbying firms in the fanciest city in the world are drinking from a 160-year-old pipe. But that's just not good practice, right? You wouldn't want to drive on roads that had last been paved and updated in 1860. Just saying that is just ridiculous, right? And the DC water folks are great folks, and they will say, look, we've only got the money we've got, right? We don't get to decide that. And that water main works fine right now. We got it on the list. We're watching it. But at the moment, we have believe it or not, we have more urgent things than a 160-year-old water main. But that's just not a good way of running things in general. You wouldn't say of your own house, let's work on the plumbing every 160 years. Let's work on the air conditioning let's paint the interior of the house every 100 years, whether it's ready to be repainted at that point or not. And so this is the vital infrastructure of the whole country, right? Everything depends. If you turned off the water to New York City for 2 days, the whole place would be crippled. People would literally die. There would be a vast, complicated, chaotic exodus. You couldn't do it. You simply couldn't do it. And climate change is going to make all of that much more urgent. There's a big world coming. The invisibility has been wonderful, but it hasn't helped us. And now we really need to pay attention. And that's part of my mission, is to say, here's what the problems look like, and here's how you solve them.
Right. That's great. You are bringing awareness to the problem. How can the typical consumer help with this?
Let's talk about some places that have problems. 35 years ago, in the mid-1980s, Las Vegas was using 250 gallons of water per person per day. The average American today, we're at 85 nationwide. So 35 years ago, every person in Las Vegas was using more than 3 times what we use today. There's a lot of water. And most of that water, more than half that water in 1985, was going to water lawns. Las Vegas residents were literally growing grass with water, with far more water than most Americans relied on for everything. And a legendary woman named Pat Mulroy was the water czar in Las Vegas. She hadn't been in the job more than a year when she sort of looked at the water use and growth curves in Las Vegas and the water availability. The water availability curve in Las Vegas is very simple. Las Vegas gets all its water from Lake Mead, which is the largest reservoir in the country, 110 miles long. And the amount of water Las Vegas can take from that reservoir was set in 1935 and has never been changed. So the amount of water a city of what was then 1.5 million people could take was based on a population of 35,000. And what Patricia Mulroy realized was they were going to run out of water very quickly. Las Vegas in the 1980s, and actually since then, has been one of the 1 or 2 or 3 fastest growing cities in the whole country. And so she said, this isn't going to work. We're going to strangle. The city's going to die of thirst if I, the person in charge of water, don't do something. And one of the things that is true about water is you don't solve water problems by passing a law or changing something or building a new plant. And today there's a problem, and 2 weeks from Thursday, there's no problem. You solve water problems a little bit at a time. And so working with the rest of the community, sometimes by explaining what needed to be done and getting help, and frankly, sometimes by browbeating and pressuring and muscling people, Patricia Mulroy completely transformed the water culture of Las Vegas. They did some really simple things. It's illegal in Las Vegas to let your sprinkler hit a paved surface. So if you're watering a garden or a lawn or a landscape installation at a business, you aren't allowed to let the water hit the sidewalk or the road. They will come write you a ticket, because in Las Vegas, water that hits a sidewalk or a road instantly evaporates and disappears. So that seems like a silly thing. That isn't about saving water. That's about changing the culture, changing the attitude. Oh, we live in a place where water's so important, we can't let it run down the gutter. We can't have misaimed sprinklers. And when that rule went into place, you could drive around the city, and everywhere you went, just like in many cities in America, whatever, the sprinklers were aimed every which way. There was, when big office parks turned their sprinklers on at 7:30 in the morning, there was water running down the gutters and into the storm drains. And she did big things. They put in place a really innovative program to buy people's grass back from them, to buy their lawns back from them. They would pay you $40,000 an acre to remove turf, which was completely inappropriate, perfect in Cleveland, Ohio, or Michigan, but not appropriate to the desert. They would pay you $40,000 an acre to remove your grass and replace it with desert landscaping. Now, most people didn't own an acre, but if you took out a quarter of an acre, they wrote you a check for $10,000 in order to replace what was there. They didn't just hand you $10,000 if you killed the lawn and put in place dirt. And at the same moment that they started paying people to remove their lawns, they passed laws forbidding front lawns in all new construction anywhere in the city. That was in the 90s, and Las Vegas, the housing, Las Vegas was one of the places with the huge housing boom and the huge real estate boom, hit very hard by the Great Recession, by the mortgage collapse. It's not Las Vegas's fault, but they built literally 100,000 homes that don't have front lawns because having a front lawn is illegal. If you already had one, fine. If you wanted to take it out, we'd love you to do that. So again, those things dramatically change people's attitudes. I can't buy a brand new house with a lawn. I can buy a brand new house that looks beautiful, but it looks like it's in Las Vegas, not Nashville, Tennessee, or Atlanta, Georgia. And also, it's so important that we'll pay you to take your grass out to change the water culture. And also, Las Vegas built among the best water treatment plants in the country. And so the way that they can keep growing, even though their water limits were set in 1935, is that they get a credit of 1 gallon of water for every gallon they put back in Lake Mead. So what they actually do is collect every gallon of water used anywhere in the city indoors, clean it almost to the point where it's drinkable, and put it back in Lake Mead. So they aren't actually reliant on the 1935 allocation. They just all day long take water, clean water, and put it back. And in fact, the water they return to Lake Mead is cleaner than the water they take out. So all in all, They have transformed the water culture of the city. People think completely differently about water. Even places like golf courses have taken out their turf between where you tee off and the green. The fairways are often not turf, or there's a narrow band of turf, which makes the golfing experience completely different. And they've cut water use in half. They're down to whatever, 130, 140 gallons per person, much more than the typical in the United States, but literally almost half what they themselves were. And in fact, it's 2019. You can go back a dozen years. You can go back 12 years. And Las Vegas has added 600,000 people in the last 12 years, but they don't use any more water than they used in 2005 or 2006 because of that water culture. And the point I made at the beginning is true. You can look at Las Vegas's water use every year from 1985 to 2019, when they've cut water use from 240 to 140 or 130. There's no year where it dropped 15 gallons a person, right? It's been 30 years. Every year, 2.5, 3.1, like that, just a little bit at a time. That's how you change water use. You change water use by changing habits and culture, which then changes how people approach things. And so when you go to Las Vegas now, you see a completely different attitude about water. People don't squander it on the sidewalk. If you buy a home built anytime in the last 50, you may be astonished to move from Orlando or Raleigh and say, where's my lawn? And the real estate agent will say, nope, no lawns. This is Las Vegas. You're allowed to have a little patch of lawn in your backyard. Your backyard, however big your backyard is, the grass can be no more than 50% of the land area in the backyard. But the result is dramatic. And so you can only make dramatic changes with water a little bit at a time. The problem doesn't get better, right? Las Vegas's growth absolutely zoomed along during the last 30 years. The water didn't get better. In fact, Lake Mead, a whole separate conversation, Lake Mead's in serious trouble. But very small changes, a little bit at a time, have led to, in fact, dramatic changes, 35 years, dramatic changes in the actual water use. They added 600,000 people without having to use any more water. And just as important, dramatic changes in people's attitudes. Those things feed each other. When you change the practices, you change how people think about the water. Once you change how people think about the water, somebody trying to install a lawn in their house in Las Vegas, like if you woke up on a Tuesday morning and said, forget the rules, I just want some sod in my front yard, that would be no more welcome than lighting up a cigarette in row 9A of your American Airlines flight, right? I'm old enough, I don't think you are, but I'm old enough that when I was in high school, you could still smoke on a plane. The back 4 or 5 rows of the airplane were filled with smokers. If somebody sitting next to you lit a cigarette today, you would tackle them and summon the air marshal, right? And that's, if you tried to install a front lawn on a recently built house in Las Vegas, you get the same reaction. Like, what do you think you're doing? So that's really important.
Do you see any of these smaller changes starting in other cities? Maybe not the extent of what is being done in Las Vegas, but are there other cities taking the right steps to fight their water problems?
Lots of places have water problems and places that aren't used to having them. Raleigh has had droughts. Atlanta has famously had huge droughts. Both places that seem lush in our imagination or that seem like places that shouldn't have to worry about water. All of Florida is under all kinds of water pressure because although Florida gets 48 inches of rain on average on every square foot of land, 4 feet of rain, for 100 years, Florida has gathered up the rainfall, considered it a pain in the neck, and used an elaborate and sophisticated stormwater system to dump the rainwater in the ocean. And then the cities and the population in Florida get their water by digging wells. And with climate change, rising sea level, the huge growth in Florida, the aquifer underneath Florida, the place they're pumping the water from, is falling. The water levels are falling. There's less water there. Cities are sucking harder and harder. And sea level rise is putting pressure on those aquifers from offshore so that they are in danger of being invaded by salt water. And by the way, the pumping doesn't help. You're pulling the fresh water, which puts pressure on the salt water as well. And so a place like Florida, which is inundated in water, literally, from the sky, which the Lord blesses with more than enough rainfall to supply water to everybody in the state, is having a colossal, complicated time managing demand for water because they've relied on a system for 100 years that isn't adapted to the new world. By the way, if you let salt water get into your aquifer, into the aquifer that supplies Palm Beach or Miami or Fort Lauderdale, you're toast. Salt water and fresh water don't mix well. Salt water always wins. And so those are really, really precious resources that need to be protected and that aren't actually being protected in the right way. So there are a lot of old habits that don't serve us well and that we need to wake up. And so some places are taking this seriously. Literally at the same moment that Pat Mulroy in Las Vegas looked at the available water and the pace of growth and said, we have a problem. Somebody in Central Florida did the same thing. I've never been able to track down the actual person, but Orange County did something very similar. They looked at the pace of growth between Atlanta, Orlando, and Las Vegas. Those are the 1, 2, and 3 places in the country for growth over the last 35, 40 years. And in 1985, somebody looked at the pace of growth in Orlando, Orange County, and the available water, which was coming from, not from the sky, but from this aquifer. And they came to the same conclusion that Patricia Mulroy had come to, which was, we're in trouble. We don't have enough water to sustain the people who want to move to Central Florida and keep Central Florida both growing and vibrant. Disney World, defense contractors, the Space Coast, all that plus sunshine, all that stuff going on. And so in 1985, Orange County did 2 things. They built a reuse plant. They built a plant to clean water and use it a second time. One of the worst habits Americans have is we use the water from the tap once and then we throw it away. And that's how our system is built. And if you don't think about it, well, would I really want to use the water from the toilet again? Would I really want to use the water from the shower again? Yes, you would. And here's how. So they built a reuse plant so that instead of simply treating the water like wastewater, they treated it like a resource. And the reuse plant cleaned the water almost to drinkable standards. And then they passed a law at the same moment they were building the plant requiring all new construction to use the reuse water for outdoor purposes. So again, in 1985, if you had a lawn, if you had a soccer field, if you had a commercial nursery growing plants or fruit, you could proceed as you always have. But all new construction starting in 1985, whether it was a school or a subdivision or a business park or a commercial nursery, had to use the reuse water for outdoor purposes, for cleaning and for landscaping. People say they put in a second plumbing system. Well, they didn't really put in a second plumbing system. You're going to irrigate the soccer field somehow, right? You're going to put spigots on the outside of your house somehow. It's just that the supply for that water came from the reuse plant instead of the potable water plant. You ended up with 2 different supplies to your home or your office or your athletic field. And the reuse water, which isn't quite clean enough to drink, it's actually probably clean enough to drink, but it isn't certified to be clean enough to drink, is delivered literally in purple pipes. The purple pipe is the universal worldwide signal that this is water that's pretty clean, but probably not water you want to make coffee out of. And it's called, as a result, purple pipe water. That's what people in the US call it. And so since 1985, every bit of new construction in Orange County, Orlando, the area around Orlando, has had this purple pipe system installed. And the goal was to take pressure off potable water. In most of the country, we water our lawns, we water our azaleas, we grow commercial crops, we grow grass in office parks, we wash our cars with purified drinking water. That's a little crazy. It's just When we started out, water was plentiful. No one thought, let's run two systems. Let's just do the cheap and easy thing. Since 1985, the population of Orlando and Orange County has doubled, and they don't use one more gallon of potable water than they did. They take every gallon of potable water, they clean it, they pipe it back out for use outdoors, and they have been able to cut the use of potable water enough to be able to double the population. And by the way, they still water their lawns, they still wash their cars, they still, grow beautiful plants at the office parks. In fact, when it's rainy, in the rainy season in Orlando, the reuse plant is furiously cleaning water. If there's no demand, if people don't need the purple pipe water, it's clean enough that they actually pipe it back into the aquifer. And so instead of draining this vital underground lake of water that they rely on, they now clean the water and return it. They replenish it. And so, again, they didn't solve that problem in 1986 or 1989. 5 years on, some people might have said, we spent $400 million on this reuse plant. What are we doing? But you can bet that Orlando is really glad, that Orange County is really glad 35 years later that they aren't pulling double the amount of water they were in 1985 out of the ground.
Do you see any of these smaller changes starting in other cities? Maybe not the extent of what is being done in Las Vegas, but are there other cities taking the right steps to fight their water problems?
I think the lessons of places like Las Vegas and Orange County, Florida, to me are really, really clear. And they're going to become not just possible in the rest of the country and the rest of the world, they're going to become essential. We can't use water once and throw it away. That's simply not practical. The key with water problems is there's not one solution. In Las Vegas, Pat Mulroy didn't look at the list of ways that Las Vegas could solve its water problems and say, number 4, that's the one that'll fix everything. She did 9 things, right? And she was only trying to save 2 or 3 gallons a person a day, right? So each one of the 9 things had a little bit of impact, but together they had enough impact a year so that 30 years later, everything was different. And so that's important. One of the first cities in the world to be hit hard by climate change was the city of Perth, Australia. Perth is a big city, about 2 million people. It sits on the far west coast of Australia. It's actually, geographically, it's very much in the same position as San Francisco is in the United States, way out there on the west coast. And culturally, it plays a very similar role. It's far enough away that it's sort of a counterculture place. Perth had historically relied on a system of reservoirs and for collecting water and providing water to the community. And literally over the course of 5 to 8 years, the amount of water, the amount of rainfall falling on Perth fell 20%. The amount of water collecting in the reservoirs fell 80% because of the efficiency of the system and the significance of the shift in rainfall, right? So a small change in rainfall, most of us wouldn't be happy if our incomes fell 20%. Most of us wouldn't be happy if we were told we had to use 20% less electricity or 20% less water, but we could do it, right? You could figure out a way to make it through a year with 20% less income or 20% less water. What happens with climate change is that 20% is dramatically magnified by the way we've designed our systems. And so Perth came within a couple of years of running out of water. They literally had a city of 2 million people frantically trying to figure out a solution. And the first thing they did was they built a desal plant. Perth sits right on the Indian Ocean, just like San Francisco sits on the Pacific. And Perth built what was then the biggest desal plant in the world, faster than anyone had ever built a desal plant. 2 years, start to finish, done. let's refer them to the moon people, including the planning and the politics and everything. And then the head of water in Perth, another really brilliant, thoughtful, far-seeing guy, said, that didn't solve the problem. That gets us past this crisis right now. That plant cost almost $1 billion. We can spend another billion and build another plant, or you all, my fellow citizens of Perth, can learn to use water more smartly. You can conserve. And I would suggest we try that and see how far we get. And within a few years, changes in the water culture in Perth, changes in how people use their water at home, saved as much water every day as the second desal plant would have, quote unquote, created, would have manufactured from the ocean. So instead of building a second water factory, all the money, all the energy forever that plant would have required, they said, you know what? We can use our water differently and we can have an impact.
This ends part 1 of the Bytable podcast, Know Better, Live Best with Charles Fishman. Make sure to listen to part 2, where we dive deeper on how we can all do our part to conserve water. We'd like to remind our audience that the views of our guests do not necessarily reflect the views of Bytable or of our staff personally. The purpose of the Bytable podcast is to encourage spirited dialogue around topics like food, nutrition, animal and human welfare, and the food system. Part of having an open and spirited dialogue is accepting that others have views that are different than ours and working to understand how their experiences have differed from our own. We encourage all listeners to do their own research on any and all topics discussed during the show. That being said, we hope you enjoyed the podcast, and thanks for listening.